Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the podcast Mounds and Memory, a series where we discuss the archaeology and history of death, burial, and the afterlife in Northern Europe. I'm Dr. Irina Mana, and I am pleased to be joined once more by my esteemed colleague, Professor Howard Williams. And today we'll be traveling to a very interesting place that is often overlooked in the Viking Age. But it was a strategic hub for the Vikings, and that place was the Isle of Man. And it's a very interesting place because not only because of the more famous stone crosses that reveal a hybridization between, Norse and Celtic elements and so on, but also because of the burial mounds and graves that were uncovered here. So I am going to leave it to my colleague to explain to us what is so fascinating about these graves and what we can find out about death and the Norse diaspora and generally the settlements of the Vikings on the Isle of Man.
Wow, fantastic introduction, Irina, and it covers almost everything I was going to say. So I'll leave it at that. No, seriously, that was fantastic. Yes, I think like with everywhere we're going to in the Viking world, we see the Viking Age is just one tiny sliver of a deeper time story. And the Isle of Man story is an island in the middle of the Irish Sea. We can trace back from the Neolithic and Bronze Age of monument building, and then we can see how through the Bronze Age, Iron Age, and then the Roman period, contacts and connections with Ireland, with Scotland, what's to become England and what's to become Wales, the constituent nations of these islands, and it does get often forgotten, as you said. It's sort of because it's so much in the hub, at the center of everywhere. Everyone's national traditions tend to ignore it. So when we're looking at the Viking world and the Viking diaspora, it's a great place to connect to the study of funerary ritual and specifically mounds. Now, we're not going to just look at mounds. We're going to look at some of the classic sites, and this will be a sort of a light introduction to the burial archaeology of the Isle of Man. And but before we do that, I think we should just sort of remind ourselves roughly where we are with my crude upside down Google Earth map, which I use with students, just to make the point that the raids and trading around these islands in the 9th century would have not been able to avoid the Isle of Man, because if you're sailing and rowing down the east coast, you're going to come back via the north via the west coast, and you will be encountering the island. And it remained such an integral part of not only connections to Francia and Frisia and Scandinavia, but also Britain and Ireland, as you could see from and the North Atlantic. You're not far away. Jump up to the Outer Hebrides and you can be out across to Iceland and Greenland. So it's hardly a surprise that the Isle of Man is such an important, as you say, node in this small world of the Viking Age. Small in terms of its big distances, but as a seafarers, many jumps between land, it would have been a very easily discoverable and an important stopping place. So it's not
it fits perfectly, right, to exploit the surroundings. So there is this whole pattern of westward expeditions. It's also suggested by the Irish Annals. But I think one of the reasons it's overlooked is because we tend to focus a little too much on the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, right? And the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is very much focused on those coastal raids. But it didn't really stay there. I mean, only there.
and yes, and the pre-Viking world of the Isle of Man is fascinating, because the Isle of Man was exposed to not only Irish and English influence, but the Brythonic world that was not only Cornwall and Wales, but Cumbria and Dumfries and Galloway, the kingdom of Reged that's going to become later the Altclut at Strathclyde, right up to all of this area would have been a Brythonic speakers, what we would call colloquially now Welsh, or Old Welsh speakers. So the Isle of Man had all those what we call crudely Celtic and Germanic influences before the Norse period. But the Norse settlement, the scale of it, there's few places south of Orkney that you could say there was such evidence of intense mixture of different place names that have been characterized as crudely Norse and Danish and Gaelic. And there's a whole debate about whether there's a substrata of Brythonic underneath that, and the debate about whether the language structure of the Isle of Man shifted to Gaelic in the to Gaelic, Old Irish, in the centuries before the Isle of the Viking Age or during the Viking Age. I have no expertise in that, and I'm not even touching that with a barge pole. I'm just saying that it's hardly surprising in the middle of the Irish Sea, the Isle of Man shows influences and connections before the Viking Age and during the Viking Age with all of these zones. So this is from James Graham Campbell and Colleen Beattie's book on the Vikings in Scotland, to make the point that while the Isle of Man just sits there out of discussion, because like all English books on Viking Age England, Viking Age Scotland. There's an amusing story for those that care about Julian Richards, who is no criticism of him. In the first edition of his Batsford book of Viking Age England, he had because he could. I wouldn't like to speak for him, but I suspect he couldn't resist, just because the burials here are so cool. He had a whole section on the Viking burials from man, but then that got taken out when it was republished. I think either the publisher or he thought it's a bit incongruous. But people want to. I suppose what they want to do is people are tempted to cherry pick the Isle of Man when it suits them and ignore it the rest of the time. And so this is just an example of a map where it just sits there. Look, you can see where it says place names are mixed Gaelic, Norse, and Jane Danish character, just all over the island. You know, there's a real it's not a replacement, but there's a real mixture in the place name evidence, and that's reflected in the archaeology and the stone sculpture that we have. So yeah, it's one way of looking at the Isle of Man is at the bottom of this Western Scottish and Northern Isles, Western Isles, Northern Isles spread, and it's that political connection stays with the Isle of Man through into the later Middle Ages and the Kingdom of Sodor. This area that links the Western Isles with Isle of Man. It's very much in that northern British zone. But of course, it was in the Viking Age itself, it was linked to areas much closer, including Inismon, Anglesey to the south, Ireland to the west, England and Scotland. So this map is perhaps a bit more balanced. And this is from David Griffiths' The Vikings of the Irish Sea. And these are some of the key places around the Irish Sea to get you geographically located. So there's Peel, which is an important Viking centre on the west coast, and you can see you're only a short sailing journey from the north of Ireland, from northern Wales, from the hills and mountains of Eryri. You can see north and see the Isle of Man from the north coast of Anglesey, Inismon. You can see the Isle of Man on a clear day, even from sea level. So it's and of course, if you're in southwest Scotland at Whithorn or Kirkcudbright, important early monastic centres of the 5th, 6th century, you can just look out and there's the Isle of Man. And from the west coast of Cumbria or from the fells of Cumbria, you know it's again easily navigable, and from the areas Strandford Loch, Carlingford Loch, this east coast of Ireland. So all of that area is visually connected. It's not just they're nearby. You can see it all on a clear day.
Yeah, it was an inevitable target.
Yeah.
As a base for provisions and captives, definitely.
The Irish Sea is like a small pond. I mean, it's very rough, and you can lots of historically very dangerous to sail, and to row for fishermen and for travellers. But it's short distance, short hops, and this other map just shows you why. Then it's hardly surprising that with a complex dynamic of movement, the importance of Dublin and its environment, of Waterford. And at Cork further to the west, of course, the Irish coast becomes a focus of Scandinavian settlement and trading. So we also have the eastern side of the Irish Sea with the Isle of Man in the middle. So this is the distribution of habitative and topographical Scandinavian place names. And there's so many debates and problems with this. It doesn't exactly map onto how many and when people of Old Norse speakers settled there. It doesn't. Seeing maps like this has been either downplayed too much or over exaggerated, depending on the scholarship and trends. And remember that the whole of the Welsh coast would have also had place names indicating at least exposure to raiders and traders, as well as some settlement. So that's just to locate us, really, so we all know where we're looking at.
Yeah, I suppose the influx of exiles would have increased exponentially once the Vikings were expulsed from Dublin, for example. That would
Yes.
have been an important episode. And also after the collapse of Viking York, for example. So yeah, it would have been a place of refuge for many of these people.
I think that's a good way of synopsizing it because the as power centers, wax and then wane, this area would have been politically fragmented, and
Mm.
we have evidence that Anglesey and Wirral were settled by Scandinavians leaving Dublin. I mean, this may be a simplification of much more complicated patterns, but I think this western coast of England, northwest England, and the Isle of Man would have been havens away from centralised building power, the kings of Scotland, the kings of England, through the 10th and 11th century. The Isle of Man was always in their sights, but never, for obvious geographical reasons, difficult for them to lock down. And when we know earlier that the Isle of Man was of interest to Anglo-Saxon kings, we have Venerable Bede telling us that Edwin sends the
Mm.
Northumbrian navy there in the 7th century. So, it's not as if interest in the Isle of Man predated the Viking Age, and yeah, and so it would have continued onwards afterwards. But it was certainly an important focus of Scandinavian settlement and influence in these late ninth, but particularly I think 10th century and early 11th century.
Right. It was strategic, but I think mo many people were also attracted by the fertile plains. I think it
Yeah.
was very productive place. So yeah, we have evidence for stable farming, for example, after 850. But no urban emporium, on the other hand.
No,
So
and
most of them
this
would
is
have been
this is
involved in agriculture. Yeah.
I don't know how many Viking scholars would wince me saying this but any island in the middle of a sea is going to be a node of trade, a fertile land for agriculture in itself. But it's interesting that both Gotland and the Isle of Man and very different parts of the Viking world, they have trading sites, but they never grow, they
Mm,
never host vast emporia. And I think part
mm,
of that is because they're too wealthy, they're too central that no one can control and lock and draw prestige and power into one location, and so almost they're a victim of their own success. And it's not that they're on a route to anywhere else, they are the place people are going, and so almost that there isn't a major urban center. No. And looking at the broader island, Manx and northwest England, we as just a general point I always get across to students and others is that it's never easy, and it never can be defined as immigrant versus native. That dichotomy is always going to, if it ever is meaningful at any one per moment, it's rapidly going to break down as families intermarry and their fortunes shift. Natives are not always going to be the victims, and immigrants are not always going to have the upper hand. Although the discourse on the Viking Age is always about the immigrants coming in and dominating. Yeah, sure, I'm not denying it, but we've got to understand there would have been in a pre-modern world of face-to-face, close-knit societies, you're never going to see it quite that simple. And we have to think about it as always. It's not just about people moving, but things moving and ideas moving
hmm
around. That people are sharing ideas, they're shifting their religion, they're shifting their practices and traditions. And they may have been doing things they thought were very traditional, but actually we can see when we look at the detail of the evidence is a real hodgepodge of different traditions and ideas. So there's a
Absolutely.
whole,
You can see it on the stone crosses, for example. There is one example I really enjoy, the one from Kirk Andreas with okay, Odin devoured by Fenrir. We don't know 100%.
yeah.
We never do know 100% if that's the case, but there is definitely some kind of pre-Christian influence going on there, and this whole hybridization of ideas, mentalities. Yeah.
Well, we've just addressed this slide, so I won't spend any more time talking about it. But yeah, it's a long period, remember. I mean, I say it's a short sliver of time in the long durée of any region, but you've also got to appreciate that, it is relatively short in terms of, I mean, it's in terms of prehistory and early history, but it's still many centuries. So you've got about a century of probably interaction before perhaps a more sustained settlement. And of course, looking at the broader pattern, we've got, around the Irish Sea, we do have different influences, different expansions of different power. And David Griffiths has argued sort of that a lot of what we're seeing could be linked to a very Norwegian way of doing things in parts of this Irish Sea world. But again, there's going to be different variations in specific areas, from the Eden Valley to the east of Ireland to southwest Scotland to the Isle of Man. And before we get to the final thing I want to say, before we get to the burial mounds, I'm just leading up to it, I'm going to get there, is there is another really important use of mounds on the Isle of Man, which links to a broader Irish Sea tradition of thing mounds or moots. And we know this is a phenomenon that isn't exclusively Norse or Scandinavian, but it is seemingly part of that diaspora tradition of open air court sites or thing sites. Everyone in English gets very confused when I say the word thing, so I have to keep lectures get very stupid when I say, well, it's a different kind of thing. No, I don't mean it's a different kind of thing. It's a different thing. But what we're talking about is open air assembly, and the Old Norse word is thing. And we have possible ones from place names on Wirral, Dublin, and Cumbria and Dumfriesshire, and they're often seen as a special Norse dimension of local administration, although actually there's a whole debate now about to what extent that is, because we just don't really have a grasp of what the various Celtic speaking peoples were doing beforehand, and I suspect that they're not so unique. But I want to point out the work of Tim Darvill, who has argued that and I should have said the photograph there is, of course, of the Isle of Man's famous thing site. So it is the sort of St. John's. You've got and in the very centre of the island, it's geographically really absolutely sort of pivotal to both the north-south axis and the east-west axis of movement through the island is the Isle of Man's thing site, and we don't really know as much as people would imagine we do about this site, and its appearance with steps is very much a modern phenomenon. But the work of Tim Darvill has suggested that the keel to the east and geophysics and preliminary survey of the Tynwald site suggest that this may be a late prehistoric barrow cemetery, and that the mound that becomes heavily adapted, at least if not invented in the Viking Age, certainly adapted in the Viking Age, and then through into the 19th century with this enclosure linking the church and the mound at St. John's, Tynwald in St. John's, may actually have prehistoric origins. This is an adapted prehistoric site, and that is interesting because, of course, prehistory is a modern concept, but people in the Viking Age were interested in old mounds across the areas where Scandinavian people are settling and interacting with the native peoples, and these older mounds people are inserting burials into them and co-opting them for new uses, including as assemblies. And those old mounds may have been important for authority claims. Maybe they were believed to be the residences of ancestors, or if you're a newcomer, you can just say, well, they were my ancestors. You can make up a story that connects, or maybe more supernatural forces of elves and other beings that you can imagine you want to connect to, you need to negotiate with, if you want to control the land and claims to its resources and its people. So these were places of power where the mound, even though we can't precisely work out what people thought the mound originally was and what it dated from, the mound was an important instrument of legal performance. It created a platform to proclaim judgments from, but also may have been a material connection to identity and ancestry. So much
this is fascinating to me. I mean, I've always loved this because I think it's something that we often forget, that the past also has a past. And the people were really trying, even back then, to plug in what they could found and what they thought they could interpret in order to, as you said, to link themselves to this kind of like prehistory, because in a way it was maybe not prehistory, but it was definitely history for them.
Exactly. And I'm very careful the way I say this, because some people do get confused when I talk about this, students and public, that I'm claiming that people in the Viking Age or the early Middle Ages more broadly had some kind of modern scientific understanding of dating and sequences and history. We don't know how deep their time and stories went, but by connecting into these sites that were clearly old and from times before, very much like antiquarians as recently as the 19th century, or indeed a lot of our pop culture, is still very much plays into that idea of there are just now and then there's old times before. And as a side project, I'm doing an archaeology of Star Wars, where there's obviously lots of ancient Jedi and Sith temples in which secrets lurk and which horrors emerge, which various characters in different shows have to negotiate access to, and even the oldest of the people don't know exactly what's there. And so you see even Emperor Palpatine is I'm just rewatching and doing a blog about Star Wars
This
Rebels
comparison
season
makes
4.
me so happy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so in Star Wars Rebels season 4, Palpatine is doing an archaeological excavation of the Lothal Jedi Temple, so he can try and make a connection between the living and the dead, because as we later find out, Palpatine is obsessed with trying to live forever. And so you have this, the past is full of potential horrors and fears, but it's also potential powers and authority. And so I'm not going to transpose Star Wars onto the Isle of Man in the Viking Age, let me be clear, but I think I'm just using that as a way of introducing to people who may be not familiar with this idea.
And I think
People
there's a
in the past had their own
commonality there. I
history.
mean, this desire for continuity, I think it's something that links it all together. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is the standard maps that we find in the books for the Isle of Man's Viking period archaeology, and there's a lot we could go through here. And I'm sorry, I'm still doing an introduction, but there's promontory forts, some of which, which are basically coastal hill forts in basically where these may have been pre-Viking or Viking age, and or may have continued later. We have some settlement sites from Ronaldsway at the airport in the south, St Patrick's Isle in the west, and settlement is least known. We have the promontory forts, which could be fortified sites and trading sites, but very few of them have been extensively investigated. Settlement sites, we've got quite a lot of hoards, as you expect. They're acquiring wealth, and surprise, surprise, the silver hoards on the Isle of Man are just brimming with information about the connections to the Anglo-Saxon world, the Irish world, the far-flung connections to the continent and Scandinavia. Yeah, so that's and then of course we've got this really amazing corpus of sculptures, cross slabs from the Isle of Man. But here I want to focus on the graves, and the graves. As with all areas that have seen improvements in agriculture, many of the graves have only been discovered and damaged in the 19th century. We've got some trashed artifacts have been found in an old mound by a farmer. And then we've got some 20th century excavations, and a lot of the best ones are from the very far north. And you site of Knockadooney, Cronkmore, Derby, Ballateare are the big mounds that we're going to talk about. But I also want to flag up on the map down here Balladoole, which is a ship burial, and we're going to discuss. And we'll talk about St Patrick's Isle and the Pagan Lady. So yeah, these are only sort of snapshots, and we wish we knew much, much more. And many sites have sadly been damaged, and there may be many more that have yet to be discovered. But these sites really together give us this glimpse onto a funerary ritual. And the sites we're finding are very conservative. They look, at a glance, hyper Norse. Uber or Norse, more Norse than the Norse, more Norwegian than the Norwegians themselves. And it almost does make you think about, whether the burial rites were more than simply we're doing as our ancestors always did. But as archaeologists, we've discussed before, didn't we, when we were discussing Iceland, how there's even a discussion of horse sacrifice there, whether it's almost a bit of a created anachronism, creating a bit of tradition, and here you could see these mounds as simply Viking chieftains and their retainers burying their leaders in the ways of old in a new land as sort of colonizers, or you could see that as a perhaps even an exaggeration. But these are the sites we're going to discuss. And as I said, the names don't use my pronunciation as a guide, because I'm not Manx and I don't speak Manx. But we have to thank a German Jew for a lot of this, Gerhard Bersu, who fled Frankfurt for England in 1935, and in classic fashion of the British, showing thanks to the German intellectual Jews that escaped the Nazi regime, as well. Gave him some time. He did excavations on some very influential methodological excavations, very important for British archaeology in the 1930s on Salisbury Plain. But then, as with many Germans, they were sent to the Isle of Man into exile, into internment. So it's an interesting story about the Isle of Man and its 20th century history and archaeology and the archaeology of internment. But he was really important because he brought the best of European archaeological method to the Isle of Man that would never have happened. So we're kind of lucky. We have one of the best German professors of the early mid 20th century forced to do some archaeology on the Isle of Man because of circumstances of war and politics and so on. And so we have that sort of bit of the world at war impacts on the Isle of Man in terms of internment of the Germans from Britain that are sent there, and one of them is an archaeologist, and he excavated at Balladoole and at Ballateare and Cronkmore in Derby parish. Those are the parishes: Arbury in the south and Derby in the north. So let's have a look at what they found then, shall we? So Ballateare is the most famous of all of them, and this is a burial mound, and it's 12 meters, a 12-meter diameter mound. That's not actually that big. That is big, that is substantial, but that's not humongous. We've been looking at some far bigger mounds in Scandinavia in previous podcasts. So that's about 30 foot. So this is a bit smaller than Mound One at Sutton Hoo. It's a meaty mound. It's tended to be a prominent mark on the landscape, but it's not massive. And it was only 3 meters high, although of course that's subject to erosion. It may have been a lot more substantial originally, but it was made of turf. And this is really cool because what we seem to have is mounds that are made by deliberately stripping a much larger area. And this should be familiar for our discussions of Scandinavia too, when we're talking about Oseberg and Gokstad. They're stripping a large amount of agricultural land to make the mounds. So there's a whole series of discussions here, not only in the Viking Age but in other periods, about is this about symbolic of fertility and the sacrifice of investment of wealth and into a funerary monument could be the actual, we talked about this before, the turf itself, the sods used to make it up. But it was really interesting, and this links to some of the other burial mounds you've been discussing separately in some of your videos, Irina, about we found cremated bone at upper levels. Now, sometimes that may be, as in the case of the Herlagshaugen, Herlags burial mound, anyway, whatever it's called, in northern Norway. That's probably because it was reused. But this, we seem to have interesting that there was a layer of cremated animal bone and a post hole at the top of the mound, which is really rare. Now, is it rare because no one's ever carefully excavated the top of mounds and not found post holes, suggesting there was perhaps a massive post and maybe with flags or pennants that marked the burial mound? Or was this exceptional? And my feeling is, given that probably, don't want to disparage British archaeologists or Norwegian archaeologists, but Bersu was probably the only person, the only type of burial that would reveal a post hole, because of the soil conditions, and the only person who could see it. So I think what we've got to imagine with many of these prehistoric and early historic burial mounds from across Europe is many of them would have had fences, they would have had posts, they would have had all sorts of other things bristling on top of them that we don't know about. And so I can't prove what this post hole looked like. Maybe it was just a little marker, but it does remind us that when we think of a burial mound, we think a nice little turf covered green, it would have been perhaps
neat
something
and organized.
It was something
like
a bit
dome.
different. And we have this eerie secondary burial, and this is of a young female aged 20 to 30, and her arms were raised above her head in the posture, and the back of her skull was sliced off with a sharp weapon. And so this was above the burial, and the interpretation has been, and I'll show you some pictures, trigger warning, pictures of a skull with a sharp force trauma. This is a slave girl or a woman of the family sacrificed to be with the man who is buried within. And that's not impossible. I have informally suggested on my blog, and I was flattered and a bit disturbed to find it then cited in academic publications, that could this just be a later judicial execution? But just to make the point that we don't have a chronology of this individual. Maybe she was killed at an old burial mound centuries into the Christian era. I'm just saying, I've got no evidence to back that up. I'm just trying to, I always like to sort of stick in an alternative theory. But she had no grave goods, suggesting that whoever this was, it's not a positive place of burial or association. So either it was a contemporary sacrifice of the time or a later punishment that they're buried in an old mound. But either way, this person didn't die well and died violently, in other words. And
Yeah, I think the classical interpretation would be that she was also a possession, kind of like an object.
I would, and if you've got cremated animal bone at this top layer, the argument would be that this is another object, but not so prized as to go into the grave with the person. Or you could say was for a later, more public stage of the finishing of the mound that needed further rituals. It's not. This is a complex sequence of actions, as we've talked about many times before. So the grave itself, and I'll show. I've got pictures on the next slide, but this is a picture of the shield in the Manx Museum, National Museum in Douglas. But this the actual burial beneath the mound was an 18 to 30-year-old adult male with a suite of weapons and personal items, which I'll show you in a minute. A Peterson Type 5 sword with a copper and a silver inlaid hilt that seems to have been broken. It was allegedly, we can't prove it, deliberately broken sword, and that matches with some of the evidence we have from Western Norway of deliberate killing of weapons. Yeah. It's in a leather covered scabbard, copper inlaid spearhead, and was the spearhead killed as well? There's also a hemispherical shield boss with deliberate damage, again suggested ritual killing. And there's also evidence of gesso decorated wood fragments with alternative white and black bands with red dots, leading to this suggested reconstruction of the Viking shields. And this is one of the few shields from the Viking Age where we actually can suggest they were painted and they weren't covered in necessarily, earnest style art as they always are in reenactment or dragons and stuff. They may have been quite simple, stark and striking, but the idea, the whole question is, was this a personal emblem, or is this more to show fealty to someone else? Is this a gift of a collection? And you see things like in the TV show Vikings and playing with both those ideas of warriors having their own distinguishing shields, or you see whole groups of warriors all with the same painted shield type. And we can talk about the Gokstad ship, which had a whole series of shields with red and yellow, I think, no, black and yellow.
Black and yellow,
yeah, that's it. So, but we have this really distinctive shield and a copper alloy strap distributor, and two spearheads of Irish type, as well as a polyhedral ring-headed ring pin. So you've got items that would
That's
be
a lot of weapons,
yeah. And so this is the most amazing. This is just I will say as a 21st century archaeologist, or I was born in the 20th century, this is like a nightmare to see how he dug this. It's so bad and yet so good. It's like something dirty and wrong, but you like it all the same, because it's kind of like he's hacked into it like a cake. He's just gone thump, But what this style of excavation does, and this is why Bezier was so good, is it allows a continuous section. So you're able to see every stage of the build up of the mound. He was able to see it. No way would you dig a mound like this in the 21st century. But equally, no way would you dig a whole mound and leave nothing for future work. So, but he didn't. He did only dig half of it. But what he was trying to do was to understand that sequence. So you've got the burial at the bottom and the post hole and the burning layer at the top, so up here, and the skeleton of the young woman. This is the grave, and this is the sketch from Berzier's excavation. And again, to make the point and emphasize to everyone who's new to Viking archaeology, despite all the AI images and wonderful artist reconstructions, and despite all the even reenactors jumping into graves they've made to posture themselves, it's all wonderful, but the reality is something like this. So the coffin, there was a coffin without nails, so it was a wood, probably a dowel constructed coffin. And then you can see the various weapons and objects associated with the individual. This is Polish artist Miroslav Kuzma, who's worked with Dr. Leszek Gadewa on a series of artist's impressions of these burials, and this is his. This is not the art. This is not Mirrors of Cosma. This is the Ballateare burial. But I just put his name up there so people credit his art, and he's created a very sort of, I don't know, you call it hyper realistic, but you've got the shield side on with the red dots between in the bands between the white and black. You've got the damage to the shield, which you could see as ritual damage, or you could see that it's simply someone who had their shield bashed around quite a lot. And you can see that the sword hilt was down here, much clearer than in the original plan. That's why it's easier to look at these, but it's all based on the evidence. And you've got the spearhead, which we presume if you're going to fit a spearhead in to a coffin, you have to break it too. Now, we don't know. I think you wouldn't snap it like this. I think you'd actually have to saw it in half or in 3 or 4 pieces. But we can't prove that either way. The wood hasn't surviving. All we can do is suggest that the spear was a high status item too. The sword is even higher status, and the furnished clothed burial with perhaps a knife around the neck and other elements. This is a pretty wealthy burial. We wouldn't necessarily assume this was a chieftain, but this is a wealthy farmer of Scandinavian, either Scandinavian himself, or he's indirectly the descendant of someone from Scandinavia who's been living around the Irish Sea, perhaps in Ireland. Or we can't. I don't think DNA has been done on this remains. The skeletal remains were very poorly preserved, and this was a long time ago. But when it was excavated, but we can't prove this person was of Norse descent or Scandinavian descent, but we can suggest the assemblage is very it's
the
out
identity
of place.
they try to create for him makes peace for some Norse settlements at least.
You can make up a story where this is an adopted son into a Scandinavian family from a local group, or we don't know. But
second generation immigrant or something.
Second generation immigrant. But the point is, these items, that's the shield boss in the center and the sword hilt and the ring pin, which is very much a Hiberno Norse type. We think they're being made in Dublin. So it shows those connections around the Irish Sea. And this is the Manx Museum's wonderful little model of the burial, which I think is great, but rather grim, because they've created this sort of miniature. There's the grave. They've put the shield in a slightly different place from Kuzma's illustration, but there's the woman at the top there, and there's the post. And the mound does look like a Viennetta or some kind of layered cake. So I was using cake metaphors deliberately there, because it always makes me hungry looking at these. That sounds a bit weird, I know. And here's the various items. So you've got the sword and the spears and the shield, and there's the grisly remains of the tragic woman's skull that's on display in the museum. So they've got the display of the stain of but this again makes clear that we're not digging up that type of stuff. It's much more difficult to discern. And these are 2 photographs of the skull, showing you the massive violence done to this person. And if this was a human sacrifice, it's not just take them into the tent, stab them and strangle them, and no one will know better. This must have been a brutal and public killing.
Wow, they removed the back of the skull.
Yeah, so it would have been a massive blow that would have literally sliced off. And that is, you could say that's classic Viking badass performance, but it's also really difficult. You have to be a very, I think, we hear of all sorts of, from later medieval and modern executions, it's so easy to make a mistake, but to do that kind of thing, it's pretty grim and violent stuff. So these are funerals involve violence. We don't know if they involve sacrificed animals. There may have been those cremated remains may have been the remains of many animals that were killed, and then a portion of them burnt on top of the mound. But we can only guess at that. Shall I pause there in case you have any questions or comments, or I've been going on a bit?
No, I keep thinking about those weapons, because I've read so much about this idea of ritual killing, but then the more I think of it, the more I realize that it is by far clear that this is exactly what we're dealing with, especially in the case of the shield boss, which we can definitely imagine that it was just a consequence of taking part in so many battles. But then again, the idea still remains very, very much attractive.
Well, you have another third route, which I don't think gets enough discussion, is the fact, as with the account of Ahmad ibn Fadlan, that they're clashing. He says they're clashing their
Right.
shields to make noise to
Yeah.
conceal the screams of the sacrificed animals
Indeed. Yeah.
and or the woman, the girl, or at least to as part of the performance. You're using the shields as performative musical instruments after a fashion. It's not exactly a Highland concert, but it's not far off. You're clashing and you're smashing, and could performative combat be a part of the rituals too? So it's not just like, oh, we're going to destroy that so grave robbers can't get it, or so it can transfer to the next world in some kind of spiritual way. I think the other way of thinking about this breakage is it could be part of the funerary ritual, is that you're doing violence to people and things. But I'm not convinced either way. I'm just saying there's ways
Yeah,
of
I mean,
there's
I think the boundaries between the people and the objects would have been less clearer than we tend to
yeah,
believe. So nowadays, either way. But yeah, I'm very happy that we're coming to Ibn Fadlan all the
yeah.
time as a resource because, yeah, his descriptions, I mean, his description is unique and then it's also extremely raw, extremely visceral. And I think it's a good match for what the kind of violence that we're seeing here
So when
going on in these rituals. Yeah.
Berzu and Professor David Wilson published the Ballateare grave, the Ahmad ibn Fadlan account was explicitly evoked as
Mm.
evidence that this is a sacrificed slave girl. As I said, I seem to have been one of the few people who dared to say maybe not, but it's still a contender. This Knockaduni was the first one excavated, actually. It was by the antiquarian and early archaeologist PMC Commode. And this was pre-Bersu, and this was excavated in 1927. And this is a slightly smaller mound, both in height and diameter. But this one doesn't seem to be made of turf, but sand packed around a core of stone boulders. But again, it may have been drawing up remains from the ground to articulate power and status and identity and links. But this was a ship burial. We've got over 260 iron rivets or clench nails, suggesting boat burial. The whole when a boat becomes a ship in the Viking Age is a bit of a topic I can't be bothered to care about. But the fact is, a 10-meter boat is a
A
smaller
vessel.
a vessel, a vessel grave. That doesn't have the same ring.
No, it doesn't.
It's a boat burial, yeah. So 10 meters long. That's pretty small for a raiding party, but pretty good for a fishing or trading vessel, smaller vessel.
Mm.
You can certainly get all the way around the Irish Sea in a 10-meter long vessel. So they buried this in this mound, not on the coast, but close to the coast. They found evidence of horse bones and a human cranium with another shield boss, an axe, a broken sword. So again, we can
Mm.
be skeptical, but looks like evidence of breakage. I don't know the exact details of whether it was the blade that was broken. I think it was. A wooden scabbard with evidence of silver wire inlay and a spear with wooden fragments associated with it. And also, as we find in some of the Scottish Viking burials, iron tools linked to smithing, blacksmithing, and fishing. That doesn't necessarily mean, this person buried here was a warrior any more than he was a fisherman or an expert blacksmith. But these items may have been sort of articulating the resources and the skills that this person choreographed and controlled as much as what they did in their life on a
Mm.
personal level, in the same way as a lord of a manor in the 19th century, if there was a tradition of burying them with grave goods, which there wasn't, but there was some weird things going on in the 19th century. But they would be buried with all the symbols that articulate the wealth of their estate, so bits of sheep wool and so on. I think it's more about that. So yeah,
Yeah, creating a social persona, right?
yes,
That's another
absolutely, yeah.
negotiating the status. Yeah.
And bridle mounts and attachments suggest that at least the head of a horse or the gear of a horse had been buried here too, as well as they found some horse bones. Not exactly the best quality of excavation, not well preserved, but certainly hinting of that package of furnished inhumation burial. And I should make the point is we've had very little evidence, if any, of cremation. The burnt bones of animals seem to be differentiated from the graves themselves. We don't have any cremation burials from amongst this collection. Cronkmore, I just have some basic information about. This was excavated in a rush by Bersu, a smaller mound of sand ahead. It was being removed from airfield. So again, the Second World War impacted and created it. He
Mm.
found a rectangular burial pit with oak planks, a male skeleton, bits of a polyhedral ring-headed pin, a plain ring head, yeah, a ring pin, dating to the same period as the others. Evidence of a sword and a scabbard, a copper alloy strap distributor again. These are common finds around the North Irish Sea world. Again, an iron shield boss and a spearhead and a knife. So another weapon burial
Mm-hmm.
of the, should we say, early 10th century as Ballateare, but much more poorly presented. A few rivets were found, but it isn't thought they were actually from a boat, but they could have been from a symbolic element of a vessel. It could possibly be from a coffin or a chest or another structure. We even have small caskets from the Viking Age which have rivets. Doesn't mean they're a boat. It just means you've got a bit, you're using rivets to hold together a chest or something like that. And then moving away from the barrows, we have the intriguing burial. The third one of Bearsu's to be excavated was the Balladoole excavation. This is the far south of the Isle of Man, and this is my favourite because it's really interesting because this is a Christian site, already a Christian site. It's in a hill fort,
Mm-hmm.
a hilltop fortification that is then later reused as a keel site, as with a chapel and a kiss cemetery of, let's say, roughly, I can't remember whether we have any convincing dates here, but pre-Viking age, so fifth to ninth century. And you can see here, this is redrawn from my book from 2006 and from a while ago, but it's just to simplify the excavation plans. Fragments of kiss burials were discovered, but they were discovered by Bearsu excavating this boat-shaped cairn.
So it
And
was directly over and through the cemetery. That is fascinating.
yeah.
Someone was
So
making a statement.
yeah, no, it's really interesting. And when what isn't really clear in the report when you go to the site is they were deliberately reusing this specific point on the hilltop that's the highest and on the very edge of the ridge. So they're actually, what's not clear is that this edge of the boat grave is the edge of the hill fort. So it's actually on the edge of the hill, not the center and the top. It's on the edge of the ridge or the break of slope, where the slope drops down the side of the hill. So this is a very prominent and dramatic statement where they're cutting through the existing Christian graves that may have been anywhere from 200 to 300 to 10 to 20 years old. We don't know. And to impose this boat on a hilltop over with views of the sea, but not next to the sea. This isn't some kind of Beowulf on the Whale Road. This is you can see the sea, but this is set back. And this aerial view hopefully articulates it clearly. So this is the boat grave now preserved. This is the it's not a dramatic hill fort. It's a small fortified, probably Iron Age fortification. But you can see how the boat grave is basically on the bank of the ramparts, reusing the part of the cemetery associated with the keel. And there's the small chapel, one of, I can't remember, 120 you've got from the Isle of Man. Large numbers of small Christian chapels that could be dating as early as the 5th, 6th century, but most certainly there by the Viking Age. And again, the National Museum has the Isle of Man's National Museum has this reconstruction of the boat with the individual with their weapons within, cutting through the earlier kissed graves.
Yeah, it's kind of like land taking, but just in the funerary context.
You could see this if you want as benevolent coexistence, but it looks like it comes, this is the Viking equivalent of what the Normans did in English towns. Is like you look at Norwich or Exeter, where the Norman castle basically they just leveled whole streets to make the castle. Like large portions of the previously burgeoning Saxon towns were just like, we're leveling that. And this is a small Viking version of the same thing. This could be seen as a deliberate erasing of the earlier graves to impose this quite overt. The thing about these barrows and these ship burials is that they're land hungry. They are like the Viking Age equivalent of AI data centers. They take up a massive amount of space. They're just imposed on the landscape. you know, and if you look back at this hill, you could put dozens of boat graves anywhere in here, but they didn't. They wanted to just ram it into the most highest and most dramatic rampart you could take to make a statement. And the artifacts are again on display. You've got horse gear, stirrups. You've got shield boss. You've got sword, and the ship nails there as well. So a knife, a range of, and a ring pin again, suggesting that they were all these guys, because they are all guys, are all wearing similar style cloak with a ring pin across, which is an Irish style of brooch, but it's fully part of this Hiberno Norse cultural world. And yeah, it's shallow stuff because that was the graves they were coming down onto. So they must have known they were there. This is not an accident.
Oh yeah.
And
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine it was some sort of ritual desecration on the one hand, and then on the other hand, again, this sort of idea of plugging into already existing monuments to establish a deep connection with them, but at the same time obliterating them. So
yeah, I mean, so
excellent
Sarah
taking.
Tarlow has seen this as she's argued this is an example of a deliberate violence done to a
Yeah.
Viking grave. And Sarah's well known for her work on post-medieval burial traditions, but this is one of her early essays where she was looking at the Viking Age and saying this is almost the archaeology of emotive action. And I think there's a lot of, when you look at the saga literature that we've been discussing, these entrances into burial mounds, whether for they're tense moments. They're not supposed to be. They're fearful events of conflict. And if I'm not saying that's the same as here, but we have to think of a world where these funerals are supposed to be evocative, dramatic acts of violence and performance. And yeah, part of that is hacking through into earlier graves. It's quite a different vibe to your standard, you know, style of thinking about these graves. Yeah, so they're investments of material wealth, the ship, the artifacts to do with seems one individual, but also they're breaking into the ground and transforming this prominent location. And the final one I wanted to talk about, I mean, there's many other fragments of burials that we don't really have exact. They were disturbed in the 19th century, and I mentioned some of those on an earlier slide, but I didn't actually speak about them. But the other site that's really important is Peel, and this is St Patrick's Isle, which sits just off the coast of Peel. And excavations in the 80s, I think it was, revealed a early medieval cemetery of 327 burials, most of them findless, Christian. This would form into a form of cemetery you find across Western Britain and Ireland in the early Middle Ages, all inhumations, but a few of them had artifacts. One infant had a coin of Edred, a 10th century coin in his mouth. One had a coin of Edmund, a West Saxon coin. And then you have two adult coffin burials with rich assemblages, and one of the richest one has a range of artifacts associated with it, and it's been dubbed the Pagan Lady of Peel. And this is the plan of the grave, a kissed grave. So this would be a tradition that you can't ethnically define kissed burial. We find it in parts of the Scandinavian world, but it's already a well-established tradition of West-East aligned. This looks like I wouldn't like to say Christian, but it wouldn't be out of place in a Christian context, right? But the artifacts are not so much. And many of the Viking Age burials we have from Britain, remember, are from church sites. So while the burials we've just been talking about that are away from churches, or are they? Because we just saw Balladoole is right next to a church and existing Christian graves. The existing burial topography is never far away. In Dublin, it's Finglas just outside Dublin. They're all these pagan burials want to be at the traditional sites in most cases. Now, Ballateare and Knockadooney and Conkmore, they are away from churches, but a lot of them we find are at Christian sites. So this is the Pagan Lady Appeal on display, her artifacts, and she's got a whole festoon of beads of different kinds showing far-flung connections in the Viking world. She's got shears. She's got items that you could easily, a comb, a weaving comb that you can see as, no, a comb, sorry, not a weaving comb, that you can see as part of a middle-aged woman. She's supine extended. So I've got the full list here. So there's, I'm gonna steer clear of the hallucinogenic herbs argument right now because I can't remember all the details and yeah, I don't want to go down
Well, she wouldn't be the first one, right? I mean,
yeah.
Fylket and Ossebeg.
Yeah, so, but I'm gonna sort of, I'm out of confidence of, I don't want to say anything that misleads people. I'm gonna stick clear of that. But but there has been the claim by others, right? You've got 2 combs, needles, copper rod with 3 beads, a stone cube, an ammonite fossil, a goose's wing, 71 beads of amber glass and jet. It's a jet from East Yorkshire, Whitby, North Yorkshire coast, sorry, Whitby, and a spit or wand. So this is the most important item for people, get people excited, because she is one of the items that first Neil
Sorcerer's
Price
staff.
and then and then Leisure Gadewa and then others have discussed as potentially a seer's staff, a seer's. And the goose's wing is an odd thing that you can start thinking of more magical performative uses of animal wings, of bird wings, sorry, to do with controlling fire and smoke and some kind of performance. Or was it part of, I can't think of a whole goose's wing being part of a dress, but maybe. But certainly it's some weird shit going on here, and it forms part of a broader pattern. You can either call this high status, or you could see it as some ritual. This is the material trace, as Price and Gadewa would argue, of women magic users in the Viking Age, for want of a better word. So seers or volvers, or some permutation of that, because we don't have to necessarily map these terms from the sources onto the graves. So it certainly shows some individuals getting some unusual treatment, suggesting that there was neither the control or the consensus over belief in these communities living on the coast of the Isle of Man. And this is her reconstruction in the Manx Museum, which I think is rather cool. So it gives her a very noble appearance. And what she doesn't have, and this is interesting, she doesn't have the standard dress accessories you'd expect from a high status or middling status Scandinavian woman, which is the oval brooches in pairs that we've discussed before. She doesn't have that. And so, you could see that maybe her wealth and her artifacts are not there to denote the woman of a kin group. She is outside, she's different. And that does encourage us to think this is a woman of power, but not power invested in the standard family structures of the farm and the community, but something other. Could she therefore could that fit into that role, or could it just be that they reused the oval brooches and gave them to her daughters or something like that? You can see it in different ways.
Yeah, I could imagine her being a ritual specialist at any rate, because of the beads that come from so many regions and have so many materials, and they're like 71, you said?
Yeah.
She was, definitely very, very much connected to all the directions of travel in the Viking world. But this goose wing is definitely interesting, because I remember that in Repton, in grave 511, there is also something similar. I think it's a jackdaw humerus bone, and then we also discussed about the Salme burials, and there are also some, I think, decapitated hawks there or something like that. So I think so, the first hypothesis would have been that such animals might have had some kind of shamanistic undertone, some kind of ritualistic undertone.
Yeah.
But then again, I think a more general explanation would be, again, in this idea of assemblage, like people and animals coming together and kind of like constituting one single element, one single fluid ontology, like divided personhood.
I like that. I do, because I think that idea is helps us to think about this not being just about their identity, but about, as we've talked about before, the various connections of materials and places. I mean, we can fit it into a magic user series interpretation, because if this person is far traveled themselves, because this could be an itinerant person, or that they're receiving gifts, but not gifts the gifts they have to display to articulate their status and show the many successful rituals they perform. They have to show their curriculum vitae, basically, on their, look at all the beads I received. I got this for healing the cows at Torbjorn's farm, or I got this for healing the son of this chieftain. But and that they're almost like displaying wealth, but it's not wealth of I'm a wealthy woman of a farm or a merchant, but I am you're showing the wealth I've accumulated through the power of my magic, my power of my prophecy. I don't know. You could, we have to at least, play with these ideas. And the thing is, there's some intriguing burials that are still, there must be more. So this is the parish churchyard at Jerby. And you can see two things here. This is from the south. No, I can't remember which direction we're looking here. This is from the north side of the church, looking north, I think. And there's two things that even the amateur archaeologists might spot. Firstly, on the skyline, there's a mound. And secondly, in the churchyard, there's a mound, and it's got modern graves on top of it. It's got a 19th century grave stuck on top of it. But that is it could be Bronze Age, but it could very well be another Viking age furnished burial. And surprise, surprise, no one's going to be digging that anytime soon because it's protected, it's damaged and protected by later graves over it. But no one's touching that. But this is very much reminds me of St. Materiana's churchyard at Tynwald in Cornwall, where we have suspicious mounds throughout the parts of the churchyard which have been proven to cover early medieval graves. And so when you see something like this, you think, oh, come on, no one's just going to leave that there. But because it's a churchyard, just as these churches have the stone sculpture surviving from the Viking Age, often damaged and reused and then discovered, rebuilt into medieval stonework, it is preserving. It's one of the few places in the landscape that's going to preserve mounds. So I can't prove it, but most commentators would suggest that is a Viking period burial mound waiting to be discovered. And we do have various other finds of items, of wealthy furnished burials that have been damaged before proper records, as here. And, we've got to remember this is part of a broader pattern. But I have to finish by just saying, and we can't cover it here, that the other great thing, as I said, that is important from the Isle of Man is the stone sculpture. And we have some really, evidence of a Christianizing hybrid society of Norse speakers, Gaelic speakers, and these may be as much claims to power identity as the mounds and the grave goods. And this is one of my favorite. It's a bit sexist to call it Sandolph's cross, because it's actually commemorating his wife. But knowing the Vikings, I think we can be it's their biases, because it's Sandolph the Black erected this cross in memory of his wife Arambjorn, and it's wonderful. Remember this would be originally vividly painted, but I say this is all about Sandolph, because it's all about the men, isn't it? Come on, here he is on his horse going, look at me. And these are all this menagerie of animals around it, which could have Christian connotations. But you've got bears, you've got, what have you got? You've got a pig there. You've got a goat. You've got goats. You've got a stag. You've got cockerels or hens on top of the cross itself. It's a fantastic array of beasts on both sides, running up the cross, with the bora chain forming the center of the cross, and then a small cross beneath the cross at the top of the bora chain. I think this is just an example of these Christianizing or converting and then Christianizing communities who are. This type of style of monument is unique to the Isle of Man, but frankly, also you find it in Pictland, southwest Scotland, elsewhere around the Irish Sea world. And Macgold here, you've got another one of these crosses with runes, a cross base, and a little ship. So a Viking age ship inscribed on it. So this is just a taster for you of another talk we could do where we talk about the really rich sculpture corpus on the Isle of Man.
Yeah, we definitely need to do that. This religious syncretism is absolutely amazing, yeah.
Yeah, and here's your Christ and Odin. So here's Odin being eaten by Fenrir.
That was the one, yeah.
And then this is Thorvald's cross from Andreas. And then have you got Christ? He's a very sort of God. He's a very sort of evangelical Christ, if it is Christ, because he's sort of waving his cross, hey, and the snakes are
It has to
attacking
be a
him.
Viking Christ.
Yeah. So it's So it's a very but there's a whole discussion of what is this juxtaposition, on each side of the same monument, telling us about the relationship of traditional pagan stories and Christian conversion. But yeah, the Isle of Man rocks. It's so many cool things.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it challenges also a bit our chronology about the Viking Age, because if you think of it, it like lasted very long, this connection with Scandinavia. It was ceded to Norway in 1266, I think it was.
That
And
sounds
then
right.
the Norse dialect that was spoken there, it was spoken until like very late, the 15th century or something. So it's definitely a place that shows us these connections and how lasting they could be. Yeah.
And so the Isle of Man, we have these amazing. We're lucky in some ways with the rich archaeology, but even those rich burials, you think, oh, if only that could be dug now, how much more we would learn with, the careful analysis of organic remains and the DNA analysis of stable isotopes of even poorly preserved human remains. And there recently, a few years ago, we actually found the first oval brooches from the Isle of Man by metal detector finds, but not in a secure burial context. But there must be more still to be found. And I think one of the problems is, I'm afraid many of the Viking Age churches are still churches. And, as with the Derby burial mound, unless we're going to knock down and desecrate 1,000 years of Christian burial, we're not going to find that many of those graves easily, in the same locations that they continue to be places of worship. But that's true of many parts of Europe.
Yeah, thank you very much, Howard. This was fascinating. I hope you enjoyed. And if you did, feel free to check out our other episodes. And we will be continuing the series with more fascinating, similar topics. Take care and until next time.